Hi, thanks for watching. Okay, so first of all, I am so sorry. For more than a year now, okay, I haven't even had a weekend day off. I haven't had a single day off. I've been working basically around the clock, late at night. It's just been a really, really hard year. So I haven't really been able to make a lot of videos. That said, a lot has gone on in the Lori Vallow case. First of all, her interview with her son, Colby. Okay, that kind of threw me for a loop because I don't just want to spit out ideas here. I really had to kind of digest that a little bit, and then just some of her behavior around the trial, and then later, just the interviews she gave, and then finally, they're just a big hate fest. It's just this massive crowd hate fest. I mean, even Lauren from Hidden True Crime just openly saying she hates Lori, and like the spectacle of seeing Colby Ryan, actually becoming friends with Lauren and John over at Hidden True Crime, and how they're almost like encouraging him not to ever talk to his mom and basically reinforcing that she's a psychopath. That may be true, and maybe they are doing the right thing. But whenever I see like a crowd, like just this crowd fest of just hatred, I'm always going to take a pause on that, okay? Because I'm confident that Lori is where she belongs. Okay, Lori is a dangerous person. Okay, definitely, no question. Um, Whether I'm ready to say she's a psychopath, I personally, I just see too many mental problems in Lori personally, and I see too many weird problems in the whole family of the Coxes that, combined with the religion, just their paranoid kind of separatist religious stance, that when I see that many problems, psychological, cultural, religious, family, I'm going to hesitate before piling on the bandwagon and just saying, oh, she's a psychopath. Okay. Now, am I ready to say she has psychological problems? Yes. Am I ready to say she is criminal? She has criminal characteristics. She's criminogenic. Yes, I would say she does have a criminal tendencies. Am I ready to say she's dangerous? Yes, I am. Am I ready to say that she had to end up helping kill her children? Okay, no, that could have been prevented. And I think the family pathologies, I think the sickness in the whole family, I think was a lot a part of how she was actually allowed to take it so far. Combined with, I think, a botched investigation of right after Charles was killed. Okay, I think if the police had done a better job of interviewing everybody, I think they would have smelled something was wrong in that family. And so I don't think necessarily she had to end up killing her children, but I think either the family or a combination of the family and the Chandler police would have had to do a much better job. And I think that could have been prevented. So before I get into the details here, I just like to say that whenever you're dealing with something like a major I don't know, like a major breakdown in an individual, where there's like outrageous behavior. Okay, whenever you get like a real incident where there's some kind of serious behavior. Now that would include way back when Lori had Alex tase whatever her ex husband, that whole incident, because that was potentially going to escalate into Alex actually killing, I think, an ex-husband. That was on the table. Whenever you have one of these major incidents, you have to kind of break it down. There's the extent to which that's just Lori herself, conducting her life, and then there's the interface with her basic family and social environment. Okay, so part of it is a breakdown of, let's say, the family fabric or the social fabric around her, and then possibly even enabling elements within the family. So let's be honest, would Lori have done any of that by herself? Possibly, but all of these events have sort of a personal, individual aspect where Lori herself is going through some kind of crisis or some kind of heated moment in her life. And then how the family and social fabric around her sort of plays into it, and all of those factors go into it. So it's not just one isolated person operating. Okay, and to me, this is just one of several areas in which what has unfolded with Lori doesn't really match, to me, what I would consider like the typical psychopathic pattern. Okay, because to me, a psychopath, a true psychopath, is not going to be a person whose behavior and whose ups and downs in life are intimately woven into a kind of a clan dynamic, like family, clan, social, religious dynamic. if you look at somebody like, say, the BTK killer, okay, he was part of a church. He was part of a community. He had a job, okay, but his actual criminality wasn't really woven into his tribal, social, religious, cultural experience. It was kind of a very, very separate, and he was really operating as a very lone, kind of a separate kind of person. The same with Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy had a mother. He had a family background. He had his law school that he was going to. He had social interactions, but his actual criminal activity was completely isolated. Okay, and I think that's something that I would expect of a psychopath. That the trajectory of, let's say, they're really antisocial activities and antisocial dynamics are going to operate really kind of in a very separate, kind of very isolated, lonely path. Okay, now of course there could be exceptions to this. Okay, but they're not really exceptions if you really think about it. Okay, so like, say, take the Corey Richins, for example. Okay, Corey Richins ended up inflicting her criminality on someone who was close to her in the family, her husband. Okay, she inflicted on him. Okay, but all of her like ideation and her, like, say, motivations were really coming out of a very separate, private part of her life that her husband probably didn't really know about. Okay, so let's say the mentality, the private motives, the fantasy, the drive to actually commit the crime is actually committed. It's all occurring in a separate place that's not integrated with the family and the social fabric. Okay. And also, even though Corey Richins had enablers helping her, okay, it was all kind of in this separate area that was not woven into her family. Okay. Whereas, like with Lori, really all the motives and all the private desires, they were all kind of woven into her whole social, family, religious experience. Okay, so that's what I'm talking about. Okay, now, so the other thing that makes me really hesitate to attach psychopath to Lori, okay, the other thing that gives me just a lot of hesitation is just the level of her personal psychological, psychiatric problems. Okay. Obviously a psychopath can have also psychiatric problems. Okay, but when a person, like, okay, if I'm going to call someone a psychopath, I'm going to expect their pure psychopathic tendencies to be at least equal to, and not like dwarfed by, their other psychiatric issues. Okay, so for example, if a psychopath just happens to also have like insomnia, and happens also to be maybe a little bit ADD, or maybe be kind of like fast and hyperactive, okay, that's not going to really take away the fact that they could be a psychopath. Okay, but if a person who potentially is a psychopath also has tremendous level of delusions, religious identity issues, and maybe even like something that looks a lot like borderline personality or something like that, at that point, I'm going to hesitate. Okay, at least me. Okay, and now we get to my third concern with, I don't know, this kind of social mania to try to, like, this hunger to like spot psychopaths everywhere, this hunger to spot the narcissist, the psychopath, like this, like we're finding the evil of society, this. And I think I can understand this, because I think, in the seeking of justice, this is a social, collective, societal drive that we have. And it kind of plays on the craving we have for justice. And I think psychologically, I think mythologically, I think the societal, cultural craving for justice, we want to find justice. Okay, part of that is finding the evil. Where is the evil? Okay, and I think when we start to tease that out too much politically, or in the media, or in social media, when we start teasing this out, let's say in the phenomenon of true crime, I think we're kind of getting into this societal hunger to sort of find, sort of seek the justice and sort of spot the evil in the world. Let's locate the evil in the world. Okay. And my concern is that, the problem I have with true crime, and because I work in the criminal world, I work in criminal defense. Okay, I work every day. I'm working on a death penalty case right now. Okay, and I've worked on other homicide cases. And so, and by the way, because I work in the federal, mostly in federal court, For example, recently we've had this phenomenon where we're blowing up these boats in the Caribbean. Okay, these high-speed boats. I can't even count the number of defendants that we've had that were crew members of boats like that. Okay, at least in every case that I've worked on, they really were carrying cocaine. Now, sometimes they relocate those boats and they reposition them to like the islands in the Caribbean so they can be part of like a chain of trips going from island to island. So they don't always have the cocaine. Okay, but I'm telling you that I have been involved in that, and so I've actually seen like the world of like say like the Latin American criminal world, the world of not just gangs but like cartels, and so at least in my case, working on a death penalty case that's not from the U.S. by the way, okay, because we work in the federal system. So a lot of our defendants are actually part of like transnational gangs, okay, and they commit really bad crimes. Sometimes the death penalty is on the table. Um, and so I've seen things, let's say in Mexico and Central America, where we're dealing with, like, say, real legitimate cartel, criminality. And when I see this true crime stuff, it's all the neighborhood, it's all the crackpots of the neighborhood, it's the neighborhood loco, crazy guy, crazy person. The husband that falls in love with some young girl and later ends up annihilating the family, or some unhappy wife that ends up poisoning her husband. I mean, yeah, I get it. It's terrible. And it is terrible, but it's not really like mega evil, if you really want to talk about it. I mean, there are people, like rich people in Latin America, that live in palaces and they are completely put together. They are sane. They don't have mental illness. And they're managing, multi-$100 million drug operation. And part of that drug operation is they have to manage, sometimes actually killing people. And the drugs they put into the U.S. actually kill, I don't know, like legions of people. We're not talking about 10 or 20 people like Ted Bundy. We're talking about, or like say maybe Bundy killed, he said he killed closer to 100, but we're talking about like legions of dead people, Or we're talking about, like, say, some of these gangs in, like, say, Venezuela or in El Salvador or in Mexico, where just an initiation into those gangs might involve that you have to take a machete and chop somebody into pieces, you know, um, and so, like, I don't know. I guess my concern with the true crime is I think we just have to be honest with ourselves. True crime is really a suburban kind of thing that we do. It's kind of like this. It's kind of like a cool, scary activity of scary stuff going on in suburbia, basically. Okay, and so let's just not forget that. Let's keep it kind of at the level where it's at. It's not really the mega evil. And I get concerned that the politics of social media is kind of trying to absorb our attention into what is not really the gigantic evil of the world. It's really not like we're not really finding like the Olympics of evil in the neighborhood. You know what I mean? It is bad. And then the other problem I have is that we're so preoccupied with evil. I think we sometimes forget about the other thing called wickedness. Wickedness. Okay. And I think that we should not allow the politics to simplify our mind, how we see the world. Okay. I think there is evil in the world. Okay, but I think very often we're called to focus our attention on things that are really more, I think, wickedness than I think actual evil. Okay, and I think that's an important distinction. So, with that distinction in mind, I'd like to propose something. I mean, this could be wrong, actually, but let's just spitball. Let's have some brainstorming here. Okay, so this is just like first draft thinking. Like, we can edit this later. But let's think freely. Let's just unplug from the true crime propaganda, and let's just think for a second. Okay, so let's just think about the distinction between evil and wickedness. Okay, and so I would propose that psychopathy is actually kind of like the high end of wickedness, not even to the level of evil. Okay, now even though psychopaths can do some horrible things, I mean horrible things, I wonder if we could just play with the proposition that maybe evil only starts with people who actually are sovereign people. Okay, people who actually have real power. Okay, sovereignty. Okay, when you think of somebody like Ted Bundy, I want to downgrade him a little bit and keep him in the wickedness basket. Okay, because I don't think Ted Bundy was a sovereign human being. I don't think he had real power. Okay. I don't think so. Okay. If Ted Bundy was actually, like, say, like a professor of psychology, and if he also was, like, say, a stockholder, in like several companies, and if he had like real power and influence, the ability just to sit with a notebook and, a ledger and actually create changes in the world that could actually kill people. Now that might be something that I would call evil, like evil. Okay. But Ted Bundy to me is just spectacular Olympic gold medal level wickedness, like the top wickedness. Because bottom line, Ted Bundy, not only did he not have power, but I think he had so many of his own mental issues. Of course, you could say it's all psychopathy, but he wasn't really an accomplished individual person with any sovereignty as a person to actually be able to impose, like, say, large scale influence on people that could potentially cause them to die. He was killing people in a Volkswagen Beetle, in a park. You know what I'm saying? Like, he was going in the middle of the night. He was going into a sorority house to knock girls with an instrument and maybe rape them or something. Of course, terrible stuff. But this is pathetic. This is the pathetic act of a pathetic person. Okay. Now that's the thing. He comes across as grandiose because he has this grandiose kind of presentation, but we have to buy into his grandiosity. You know what I mean? If you really think about it, he has a grandiose aura about him, Ted Bundy, but he really is a pathetic guy who has no power. You know what I mean? He doesn't really have power. Yeah, even an animal can go kill an individual. A bear in a neighborhood can kill an individual child. What are you going to call that? Evil? I mean, that's not evil. That's what happens. So I think somebody like the BTK killer or Ted Bundy, these are not grandiose, powerful, amazing, impressive people. They have the aura. They have their own personal aura of grandiosity, but these are pathetic people that don't even have sovereignty. These are people that are besieged by their own, just pathetic. They can't even manage their own emotions. You know what I mean? So these are almost like children in adult bodies, basically. So what I'm really talking about, I'm talking about dismantling and undoing the spell of the psychopath, or the spell of the grandiose concept of the psychopath. Okay, when you take away the grandiosity of the psychopath, which really, why are we going to concede their grandiosity? That's what they try to impose on us. But really, if you don't buy into their aura of grandiosity, when you can see the psychopath as a pathetic person who doesn't even have sovereignty over their own emotions, okay, a pathetic person with no real power, all right, you burst the bubble, you burst the balloon of the spell of the psychopath. You see that these are just pathetic people, okay, and there you can situate them in the category of wickedness, not evil, wickedness. Okay, maybe they're at the top Olympic level, but when you take away the spell of the psychopath, there's no longer a spell to it. It's no longer this grandiose, impressive thing. It's just pathetic. Then now you can see the whole spectrum of wickedness, which is not just the psychopath. The psychopath is just one kind. It's like there's pepperoni, but then you have your ham, you got your anchovies, you got your mozzarella, you got your sauce. There's all kinds of wicked people. Okay. There are people who are a combination of borderline, or maybe they're not even a full borderline diagnosis, but they have borderline characteristics. Maybe a doctor wouldn't even fully diagnose them, but they just have enough characteristics. You combine that with maybe some alcoholism, with some depression, maybe there's some family issues, some family dynamics, and suddenly you can produce spectacular things, sometimes even homicide. Okay. And what is that? Evil? Yeah. I mean, whatever, you call it what you want. I'm going to call it wickedness. Okay. I like to distinguish things, you know what I mean? And so I don't want, because of the politics of true crime, I don't want the spectacular nature, maybe, of some of the suburban wickedness that goes on. I don't want that to take all my attention so that I no longer have attention to actually consider the real evil in this world. Okay. There is real evil in this world, but it's on a much larger scale. And it involves people who are not even psychopathic. Okay. Because the people who really inflict the major evil in this world that results in the life or death of sometimes even millions of people or thousands of people. These are people who are completely compos mentis. These are people who do have sovereignty over their emotions. They are at high levels in the government or in business or in the multi-$100 million level of like cartel business. And these people are making casual decisions that risk or put in jeopardy actual lives, but on the level of thousands. So I want to reserve at least some of my attention. I ask that I can at least have 30% of my attention to focus on the real evil of this world, so that I'm not monopolized by all this suburban wickedness, which is important, but I want to give it maybe 50% or maybe 40% or 60%. But I want to have free some of my bandwidth or my memory in my brain. I still want to have some room to consider the real evils of this world, or at least, the things, the evil in this world that is committed by people who don't even have mental problems. Okay, and here's the news flash. A lot of people, even psychologists, say that what makes a psychopath is they don't actually have mental illness. That is bullshit. That is 100% bullshit. And you can always count on psychologists and psychology to produce a lot of propaganda that is really just bullshit. Okay, because a psychopath is a person who, however their grandiosity, however they present, and even though they may not have psychosis, even though they may not have bipolar, maybe they're not even vulnerable as personalities, but they don't have control over their own emotions. Okay. And we always say psychopaths don't have emotions. What are you talking about? Psychopaths are full of emotions. They can't even control them. The drive and the desire to go and rape a woman, that's an emotional drive. Okay. And they don't even have control over it. Okay. So these are people that don't have control over themselves. They're not as put together and smooth as they make us think. They come across as not having real feelings, but they have drives, maybe more primitive drives, but they don't have control over themselves. So these are not even sovereign people. So um, I don't know. I think that's a mental illness. I'm sorry. That's not even having basic control over yourself. So basically, the whole point of this is just, let's not let the politics of whatever this thing in the media is, with the true crime phenomenon that wants to monopolize our attention on a realm of wrongdoing and problems, problems with people that really are not even really truly evil. Okay. And that it deserves a category, but that's a category we've had for centuries in the English language, which is the category of wickedness. And it's a real category. It deserves attention. I just ask that maybe give it 50 or 60% of our attention, so that our remaining attention, because attention is a resource, can actually be left to consider the real evil of this world. It's just an idea. So I put pictures of Charles Manson in the little gallery of photos here. And I did that on purpose because, after all these months, thinking about Colby's interview with his mom, and just, how people have been reacting to Lori Vallow, and just this massive, collective hate fest, this crowd hate fest basically against Lori Vallow, and I've just sort of, taken some time, and I'm not even sure what I really think in the end, but I'm pretty convinced that Lori, whatever her pathology, it was very tribally integrated. It was very integrated into her tribal, family, religious, social experience. Okay. And somehow that pathology how would you say, was not mitigated by her, let's say, her religious institution. She was a member of a religious institution, and what did that religious institution do to spot her problems, to notice her pathology, and maybe even mitigate it? And sadly, I think what the Mormon church did, at least in her case, was it probably fueled her problems more than mitigated her problems. Okay. I'm not even really sure why that is. I don't even want to try to imagine why. Okay. But she was always integrated into a system of a family and a religion and a social network. And so nothing she did was really totally in secret. Okay. There may have been little pockets of secrecy with her, but enough of what she was doing was sufficiently exposed into a religious, social, family environment that I think there were opportunities for bad things not to go so far. Okay. And so when I look at exactly what caused the train wreck of Lori, actually ending up killing even Charles, you know, I think that is a distributed family, religious, social phenomenon. Okay, that Lori's a part of it, but I think there were a lot of aspects of her religious life and her family life where people probably could have noticed what how she was changing and maybe escalating in her kind of like midlife crisis or whatever she was going through. And maybe in another world, people could have maybe not stepped in directly or confronted her, but there could have been, let's say, things could have happened to help mitigate and absorb a lot of what she was suffering at that time. So I'm going to at least put some of the guilt, I guess, or the responsibility, or at least the cause. What caused all this? Some of it was Lori's family. Because they had this thing where, as a family dynamic, whenever Lori was getting kind of weird and crazy, it was just the politics of the family was let her have her delusions, let her have her whatever she wants. There was nothing to mitigate and absorb and kind of help kind of carry her through tough times. It was just let her have her insanity because what? Because she'll get upset. I mean, the family was not set up. The family, the family pathology was part of the problem. Okay. And then likewise in the religious, I can only imagine, when Lori would go see some bishop in her church, the bishop was probably half drooling over how hot she was at the time, probably, and because Lori was such a devout and such a happy member of the Mormon family, I'm sure that the bishops or whatever, they're half just, I'm just so happy. Such a good looking woman is, so happy to be part of us. And I wonder how much of their attention was really focused on analyzing some of the clear clues that she gave off when she really openly talked about homicidal ideation in her Mormon activities, and people were just weren't set up, to help mitigate that. And so I have these photos of Charles Manson because for some bizarre reason, after just kind of meditating on this case over the last year or so, especially giving consideration for Colby's interview with his mom, because I think that was such an important interview. I don't even know if I have time to talk about it right now, but it kind of helped me get a better sense of her in a way. And then also other interviews she did, after the trial or right around the trial, you know, and for whatever reason, when I think about like, who does she remind me of? And I talked about Ted Bundy. I talked about the BTK, these classic psychopaths. I even talked about that psychopath, clear psychopath in Utah, the one who killed her husband, the Corey Richins. Now, to me, she is a psychopath. Now, of course, I keep Corey Richins in the pathetic suburban category because she is pathetic and suburban. She doesn't have sovereignty, but she, to me, is a psychopath. Okay. Corey Richins is a psychopath. All right. But Lori, to me, I guess I see more Charles Manson. I see more of a Charles Manson. Now, the question is, do I think Charles Manson was a psychopath? I don't really think so. I think Charles Manson, like Lori, had an oversized lion head of, a lion's head of charisma. Okay. A lion of charisma. You know what I mean? Probably so much that it just kind of intimidates the whole damn family. It probably even intimidates people in the Mormon church, And so that's the problem I see with Charles Manson is he's just this lion of charisma, just way too much charisma, way too much presence as a person. And yet, if you really think about it, he's kind of a pathetic guy. Definitely so much grandiosity that he couldn't even control his own personal life, So don't be fooled by the spell of the grandiosity, But why do I not think of Charles Manson as wicked as he was, a wicked person? But why do I not qualify him as a psychopath? I just think the defining nature of a psychopath to me is that the real like criminal ideation to me of a psychopath, the real criminal thrust of a psychopath, the real criminal experience of a psychopath to me is always kind of carved out into a very private, very lonely, very solitary experience. And they may have integration, and they may have some interaction in like say businesses, or like say in their tribe or in their church, but the actual core criminality of a psychopath is kind of separated into this very isolated, very lonely place. Okay. And I just think that Charles Manson, like Lori, was this lion of charisma, but Charles Manson, like Lori, he was such a social animal who had to live in the social fabric of his adopted family, or his commune, or his cult, or whatever you want to call it. And so it was all wrapped into his cultural, religious. I'll call it religious, because I think Charles Manson was religious in his own crazy way, but his own kind of religious experience, cultural, religious cult experience. You know what I mean? And so his criminality wasn't really carved into a private, lonely place, you know? And so those are just different animals, you know, like David Koresh. David Koresh was not a psychopath. He was wicked, wicked. David Koresh was a wicked person, but he's just a different type of wicked. That's not a psychopath. That's a that's just a person who's got huge amounts of charisma, huge amounts of grandiosity. Now, grandiosity, psychopaths also have that, but again, I think the true psychopath, I think their actual core criminality is much more private. Okay, so David Koresh, Charles Manson, I think they have that combination of complete tribal religious integration, where all of their criminality is woven into their open religious tribal experience. Okay, but their weakness and their wickedness has a lot to do with their oversized, just grandiosity, and oversized, huge charisma. Okay, and I think that even in Lori's family, as sick as it was, and her dad, I think, really is a toxic guy. Okay, but I think even her dad and her mom together probably had their hands full with the oversized nature of Lori's massive charisma. Okay, and so when you think of like massive charisma, it's almost like if you were to take, like, say, a dachshund dog, like a little sausage dog, okay, but then you put the head of a pit bull, okay, on a dachshund's body, okay, you know what I mean? That's kind of like, when you think of that, you think of almost like the Greek mythology, where you have these like creatures that are like half monster, you know, half animal, half human. But it's almost like Lori is almost like this misshapen combination of monster elements, where her head is like a pit bull of charisma, but her body is like smaller, like a sausage dog, you know, like a dachshund. And so you see that she's kind of a victim of like a deformity, you know what I mean? Because her whole body can't really, she's not really fully formed to actually contain her own charisma and grandiosity. So she doesn't have control over it. It ends up becoming basically a type of mental instability, you know, where it's out of control. It's a dysfunction. Okay, so she may look glorious from some angles, but when you really pan out and you look at her, she's pathetic because she doesn't have sovereignty. Okay, so she belongs in the category of the wicked, but I just think that she's more of a social tribal wicked. You know, she's a phenomenon of the tribe, of the social religious, you know, family environment, and not that kind of private solitary thing that I think is the psychopath. So basically, yeah, I think Lori is a wicked person for sure, but I just kind of see her as kind of like in the neighborhood of a Charles Manson, you know. And again, you know, we're talking about some terrible people, but I just urge us all to keep the perspective, you know, that the world of the wicked is bad enough. We don't have to elevate it, because when we elevate it to the level of evil, I think we have a way of kind of eclipsing and cutting ourselves off, so that we no longer have attention and concern and appreciation for what is the real evil of the world. Okay. And I really urge people to leave some room in their attention to really look at the true evil of the world. Okay. And I urge people to consider that maybe those people, the really people that do not have mental problems, okay, I think I would not call them psychopaths. I would say those are not even wicked people. Those are people that are sovereign, that are actually, exposing the world to real jeopardy, you know, which I think deserves to be called evil, separate from wickedness, you know, which is really kind of pathetic, you know. So anyway, just some ideas. I wish I had more time, and I will make more videos at this point. I do want to talk about Corey Richins. I want to talk about that OnlyFans murder in Miami with I keep forgetting her name. It doesn't matter. She killed the Nigerian boyfriend. The question of whether she stabbed him or threw the knife or whatever. But I think that's a case that deserves a lot of attention. It definitely comes from the world of the wicked, so we need to talk about it. But anyway, as always, I really appreciate everybody's patience with me because I'm not always clear in the way I talk, and I don't always have time to organize these videos. But I really appreciate everybody's attention, and thanks for watching. Talk to you later.